The Viscount's Redemption. The Viscount's Redemption, a Regency romance. Chapter 1. The Shadowed Hall. Ashbourne Court kept its windows like watchful eyes upon a winter of its own making. Even when the April skies lifted into a quiet blue and lambs called across the lower pastures, the house remained a study in restraint, curtains drawn with soldierly precision, fires pared to moderate embers, a silence that felt appointed rather than accidental. Ashbourne was ruled by a man who had given up conversation with the sun. Adrian Tremaine, Viscount of Ashbourne, was not old, and yet the grief of losing a younger brother had taken years from what should have been the kind of face artists enjoyed, the kind with strong planes and a mouth that knew how to smile. It had not smiled in 2 years. The village said he had nursed his brother through fever, held a hand that grew lighter by the hour, and when the physician declared there was nothing left to do, Adrian took the last task upon himself, to survive in the absence of the one who had been his mirror. In houses where grief lingers, small rebellions bloom. A sheet of music slid out from beneath a door. A boy laughed too loudly in a corridor and then bit the sound in half. Servants exchanged recipes and glances. They grew kind in private and careful in public. Even the dogs learned to place their paws gently on the marble floor. News travels the way violets travel, quietly, and then all at once. When word came that a lady doctor was to open a modest infirmary in the old vicarage, the county lifted its eyebrows. A lady? Doctor? Both ideas caused china cups to tremble faintly against their saucers. Dr. Eliza Hartwell arrived on a pale morning, with 2 trunks, a stack of medical texts wrapped in oilskin, and a face that had seen sorrow and elected not to make a career of it. She was not severe, nor did she wear defiance like a badge. Rather, she moved as if every hallway could be made more kindly by the passing of her step. The first time Adrian saw her, she was kneeling on the vicarage path, retying a little girl's boot. The child's tears had slowed to interest in a white feather Eliza conjured from her pocket. The mother, relieved, thanked the doctor with a curtsy that looked surprised to find itself so deep. Eliza rose, brushed her hands against her skirt, and glanced up. The Viscount had halted at the gate without meaning to. Their eyes met. 2 strangers measuring the new and the necessary. "Lord Ashbourne," she said, as if they had been introduced by the air. "Still water in the lane near your east fields. I'm told it breeds summer fevers." "My steward is engaged upon the matter," he replied, the words clipped, the tone civil from long practice. "Good day, Dr. Hartwell." He tipped his hat and left, the exchange tidy as a folded letter. Yet that evening, he told the steward to drain the lane without delay, and the steward, who had been meaning to propose it for weeks, permitted himself a private smile. The village learned the doctor was competent and kind. She set broken wrists, coaxed stubborn coughs to loosen, and spoke to frightened children in a voice that made night seem suddenly negotiable. She took no credit for recoveries, and accepted blame for none she could not avert. When she walked the lanes, she carried her bag, and also a presence. You were safe for as long as she was near. At Ashbourne Court, nothing changed, and then, in small increments, everything did. The Viscount began to ride at hours that happened to intersect the vicarage path. He paused once to ask after a tenant's child and discovered, to his annoyance, that the doctor's answer interested him. "Children mend," Eliza said, "when given the quiet and the soup to do it." She added, after a breath, "Men mend too, Lord Ashbourne. It only requires longer quiet and better soup." He looked away, not at the humour, but at the plain mercy threaded through it. It was an unfamiliar invitation and therefore suspect. And yet he came again the next day, and the next, as if the roads had been laid for that purpose. Chapter 2. The Healer's House. The vicarage had been an unremarkable house before Eliza arrived. She admitted as much. but with whitewash, scrubbed floors, and the kind of order that does not feel like a lecture, the place warmed. Herbs hung in neat ropes from the beams. Sunlight learned the trick of falling accurately upon instruments that preferred to be judged clean. The kitchen smelled of broth and thyme. Eliza worked not only with hands and tools, but with regions of silence. She understood when to talk, of weather, of hens, of anything that might keep a patient from slipping into fear, and when to let a quiet stretch until the body remembered the possibility of peace. She had studied under a progressive physician in Bath, had learned how to listen with fingertips, and to doubt the cure that promised everything but rest. Once, Adrian arrived with one of his grooms who had taken a fall. The groom's anxiety knotted the small room. The Viscount's presence made it worse, too much alertness in too tight a space. Eliza did not ask Adrian to leave. She handed him a kettle and asked him to pour hot water into a basin. Slowly, please. And by the time he had finished, the room had shifted. The injury belonged to itself, and not to fear. The groom, reassured by the unlikely sight of his lord standing with steam on his hands, began to breathe as if the future had been returned to him. "Thank you," Adrian said when it was done. "You poured very well," Eliza replied, without even a hint of smile to make it small. He lingered on the way out, as if the doorway were a geography problem. "You know," he said at last, "what to remove and what to leave." "That is most of healing," she answered, "and a little of housekeeping." It was an easy sentence. It entered him and found a chair. Later, at the court, he passed the music room where a piano stood silent, its lid lifted as if in hope. His brother Matthew had played with a cheerful ferocity that made even the curtains applaud. Adrian had avoided the instrument since the day silence took its place. Now he closed the lid gently, as one draws a shawl over a sleeping child, and stood there a long moment with his hand upon the polished wood. That night, unable to sleep, he opened a drawer and replaced a letter he had read 100 times and learned nothing from. He did not read it again. He set it on the fire and watched the script lift into brightness and then ash. When a man chooses to let go of the sentence that kept him miserable, the room breathes with him. The county, faithful to its sport of watching, attempted conclusions. The lady doctor and the Viscount had been seen in the same lane twice. Eliza, aware of such arithmetic, declined to perform it. Her concern was the new fever that had appeared among the children near the mill stream. She wrote to the miller, and she rode out to see the water for herself. Adrian met her there, already angry with the stream and the mill, and whoever had forgotten how easily summer breeds illness. "Give me the names," he said. "They are children, not accounts," she answered, and then she smiled to take the sting away. "But yes, I shall write them for your steward, and for you." The list came that evening. So did Eliza, with a basket of herbs for the kitchens and precise instructions for boiling and washing. The housekeeper, Mrs. Penfold, sceptical on principle, obeyed, simply because the doctor sounded like a bell, clear enough to assemble people. On the 4th day of broth and boiled bedding, the coughs eased. Eliza got nothing for it but exhaustion and a loaf of bread from a grateful mother who had nothing else to give. When Adrian tried to pay for the bread, Eliza shook her head. "If you pay for it, it ceases to be the thing it is. What is it then? A loaf that says thank you where words would be too proud." "Then we shall be humble," he said, and carried it to the kitchen himself. Chapter 3. Letters Not Sent. Grief is not a single object one sets upon the mantel and dusts weekly. It is a long corridor with doors you forgot were there. Some remain locked, some open of their own accord when the weather changes. Adrian walked his corridor nightly. Sometimes he woke at the piano, sometimes beneath the old hawthorn tree where his brother had climbed as a boy and proclaimed the moon an orange ripe for the taking. Sometimes he woke at his desk, cheek against a ledger, numbers like small boats he could not board. Eliza did not prod at grief with questions. She gave it something to do. She asked Adrian to bring warm bricks for a convalescent's feet, to mend a latch on the vicarage gate, to stand in the room while she bled a man who had no one else to hold him steady. She did not ask him to talk about Matthew, and so, of course, he did. "We were fools," he said one twilight, the vicarage windows soft with reflected cloud. "We believed we had years enough to waste them. He made me laugh like a thief, as if I were stealing joy out from under propriety's nose." Eliza turned the wick of the lamp down and then up again, giving darkness and light equal consideration. "Laughter is not a theft," she said. "It is a tithe. We give it because it is not properly ours. You talk like a vicar. I talk like a woman who has buried people and declined to bury herself beside them." He breathed, as if he were learning the lesson. She showed him the infirmary ledger she kept with the care of someone who respects every penny she touches. It was a narrow book filled with names and brief notes, an ankle, a tooth, a fever, a birth. He read it as if it were a novel in which he might appear. "Here," she said, tapping a line, "is where we shall add a page, the village fete." "I do not fete." "You do not fete yet," she corrected. "But the fete is a medicine. The village needs to see itself whole, and you need to be seen by it. If it is not too much, will you lend your lawn and your musicians? There are no musicians at Ashbourne." "There will be," she said, with that clear bell tone that made compliance feel like the most reasonable idea in England. He allowed himself to be persuaded. Mrs. Penfold, who had once organised a dinner for 40 in 3 hours when a notable duke arrived with opinions, took the fete in hand and bent it to her will. Bunting appeared, tables soldiered into rows, children rehearsed a play about a shepherd who had lost his sheep and found them by listening rather than shouting. The miller contributed flour, the seamstress donated leftover ribbon. The vicar, who possessed a decent baritone, volunteered a hymn. Through all of this, Eliza moved like a conductor whose orchestra had been waiting for a sign. She did not centre herself. She centred the work. Adrian watched and felt his house adjust its shoulders, as if a weight had been shifted from one side to the other. The county came. Of course it did. Where there is cider and gossip, there is the county. And there, in her palest muslin and softest smile, came Lady Cassandra Vale, once nearly betrothed to Adrian, the arrangement halted by Matthew's illness, and then his death. Cassandra was a woman who understood how to make an entrance and how to tidy an exit, so it appeared graceful even when it was not. "Lord Ashbourne," she said, offering a gloved hand like a doctrine, "how good to see the house alive. You have been missed." "By the house?" he asked, too tired for diplomacy. "By everyone," she said, allowing the misstep to become an elegant turn. "I see you have employed novel help." "Eliza Hartwell is a physician," he replied. "Of course." Cassandra's smile found its small cruelty. "I had heard she is very useful." Eliza's attention was elsewhere, on a child who had tripped, on a mother whose hands shook with too much hope. But she felt the temperature of the air change, the way a woman does. When she looked up, Cassandra was already drifting away toward a cluster of admirers who liked their sympathy folded and perfumed. A storm cut across the edge of the fete, rain arriving in a dramatic curtain that made the children shriek with an odd, rehearsed delight. Eliza guided everyone under the awnings, laughed at the weather as if it were a badly behaved guest, and handed out towels with the authority of a naval officer. "Lord Ashbourne," she called, "will you see to the elderly through the east doors? Mrs. Penfold has tea. It is not strictly medicinal, but I prescribe it." He obeyed, of course. He obeyed because a man who has been walking in a long corridor of doors understands what it means when someone opens one and light falls in without asking permission. Chapter 4. The music room opens. The fete became story, and story became belonging. The villagers spoke of Ashbourne Court in the plural now, our house, and Eliza's infirmary filled with the kind of patients who were almost well and needed permission to say so. Cassandra visited twice with a headache and left without it, vexed by the remedy's simplicity: water, rest, a reduced audience. "It must be comforting, Dr. Hartwell," she said on the second visit, "to find oneself useful to those who ask little." "It is better," Eliza replied, "to ask nothing for oneself and find one is still useful." Cassandra smiled the way a painter might at a blue that insists upon being the sky when one had planned for it to be a lake. She praised Eliza's tact to everyone who wished to hear and to several who did not. She also allowed, through careful pauses, the idea that the doctor was perhaps over-involved with the affairs of Ashbourne Court. Music returned to the house by accident. A travelling violinist, lost on his way to a fair, stopped at the door to ask directions. He carried his instrument like a friend and his hunger like a confession. Eliza, who happened to be delivering tinctures to the kitchen, gave him lunch and asked him to play one song in repayment, because payment is a kind of dignity and must be permitted. He played not one, but 3, standing in the entrance hall as if it were a stage modest enough for miracles. The sound ran up the staircase and found Adrian in his study as surely as water finds the sea. He stepped out and did not speak, for music had come into the house without an invitation and must not be frightened back into silence. The violinist's bow found something lost, and the house learned how to exhale. "Again," Adrian said, when the last note hung and let go. Eliza met his eyes across the hall and nodded with a practical joy. After the musician left, she walked to the music room, lifted the piano lid, and rested her hand lightly on the keys. Not playing, not yet. Permission is a delicate bird. She would not make it shy. That evening, Adrian opened a cupboard and found a stack of Matthew's music, the pages worn at the corners. He placed them on the stand and stood there listening to the absence as if it were a campaign of its own. Then he sat. His hands hesitated, remembering their orders. He struck a chord and winced, and then tried again, gentler. The sound wobbled like a foal, stood, and discovered its legs. He played poorly. He played bravely. The servants walking past pretended to need something from the end of the corridor so they could linger without being caught at it. The house smiled into its sleeves. Chapter 5. The Fever and the Fault. Illness returned the way rain returns, without malice, entirely itself. A rash spread among the Mill families, and with it the fever Eliza feared in spring. She had watched the stream, counted the flies, written the letters. Now she counted pulses through the night, and wrote to no one because she had no hand to spare. Ashbourne Court converted its ballroom into a ward within an hour of Eliza asking. No questions, no commentary. Beds appeared. Linen was aired. Mrs. Penfold supervised the boiling of what felt like the county's entire supply of water. Cassandra came with baskets of lemons and a face that wished to be useful. Adrian moved like a man who had remembered his task and was relieved to be performing it. He carried, lifted, soothed, sat. He held a child against his shoulder for 2 hours while Eliza cooled the fever from her brow with cloths. "Breathe," Eliza said to the parents and to the Viscount, and perhaps to herself. "Breathe, and the body will follow." The fever took 2 little lives before the tide turned, and Eliza went home at dawn with her shoulders squared against the temptation to count those as a failure rather than the many as saved. She washed her hands until her skin objected, made tea with fingers that would not obey, and sat on the vicarage step to watch the world return to the colour that means morning. Adrian sat beside her without announcement, 2 mugs in his hands. One he offered, the other he kept like a promise followed by application. "You smell of lemons and fatigue," he said. "I prefer both to the alternative," she replied, and allowed herself to lean against the stone post. "Matthew died," he said after a long time, "because I delayed in calling for help." We thought it was a common fever, and I insisted on the country air. When the physician came, he assured me nothing had changed in a day. But in the conversation between those two sentences, the poison did its work, and I made a religion of fault. It comforted me because it was heavy, and I wished to be punished by something I could lift. She did not correct him. She let the confession sit between them like a third person in need of breakfast. "You may keep fault, if you like," she said at last softly, "but I would suggest you enroll it as a servant and not a master. Tell it to make tea and to stand in the doorway and to warn you earlier next time. Do not let it tell you where to live. You make grief a house with rules. Every house has rules. Otherwise the windows try to be doors and the chairs attempt to be goats." He laughed then, one of those low surprise sounds that a man gives when he has been caught not being careful. He set his mug down and reached for her hand. He did not take it. He only allowed his fingers to hover above hers, like a vow considering how to be spoken. She neither withdrew nor advanced. "Dr. Hartwell," he said, and the title felt suddenly dear. "Eliza." "Yes. Will you suppose with me what it might mean to live in a future? Not today, not even tomorrow, but to write it down, to make the attempt visible." She looked at him and saw a corridor with doors, some closed and some opening, and in the far distance a window thrown wide. "Yes," she said simply. "Write it. We will read it aloud when the fever is entirely gone." Chapter 6. The Quiet Proposal. The fever ebbed as if persuaded by the argument of clean water and linens aired in honest sun. Children returned to running. Mothers cried privately in relief and publicly asserted that they had not been worried at all. The ballroom shed its ward identity and returned to its mirrors, though the mirrors kept a memory of beds in their silvering, the way surfaces honour what they have reflected. Adrian asked Eliza to walk by the hawthorn. He wore no uniform but his best ordinary self, which is the right attire for any proposal. The tree was in quiet blossom, as if illustrating restraint for other trees. "You asked me to write the future," he said, producing a folded paper. "I have been practicing not reading letters. Now I must practice making one." He read from the page without performance, a list of work and willingness. That he would fund the infirmary without making a possession of it. That he would accept her professional judgments and her refusals when refusal was appropriate. That he would stand beside her when the county found her choices untidy. That he would not seek to tidy her. "You are asking me to be your wife," she said, with a small smile that did not diminish the enormity of it. "I am," he replied, "and also my friend, and my argument when I am foolish." "Viscount," she said gently, "you will need more than one argument. I will gladly entertain a crowd of them. You are improving," she decided, and then let a silence form and fill and resolve. "Yes." He took her hands then, both, and bent his head as if in prayer, which in a way it was. He did not kiss her. He believed in order, and Eliza respected the man who had learned it kindly rather than with severity. They walked back to the house, not touching, and yet everything touched. The announcement did not stay quiet for even a polite hour. Cassandra arrived at the vicarage with a bouquet that looked like an apology disguised as flowers. "I wish you happiness," she said, and meant it in the only way she knew how, ambitiously, expensively, in a manner that suggested happiness might be a gown one orders from Paris. "Thank you," Eliza replied, accepting the bouquet and placing it immediately into water so that gratitude would not seem theoretical. Later, alone, Eliza sat with the bouquet in her lap and permitted a small tremor of fear. Not of marriage, that felt like a room with 2 chairs placed close, but of the county. She had learned how quickly benevolence can announce itself and how swiftly it can withdraw when asked to work. She wrote a letter to the women who had been her patients, to Mrs. Greeley with the stiff knee, to Anne who wanted a baby and had one now and could not sleep for checking that it continued to breathe, to the old midwife who had taught her more than the professors were willing to name. She told them the truth, that she would marry, that she would continue her work, that the infirmary would stand. She sealed the letter with blue wax and gave it to the postboy with a coin large enough to make memory out of negligence. Chapter 7. Storm before the music. Cassandra, having discovered that envy does not make a comfortable pillow, chose honesty as a second bed. She visited the seamstress who had been paid late by the mill, visited the miller who had paid because a quiet debt had been forgiven by Ashbourne, and then, after arranging these facts into a little bouquet of her own, she went to the vicar to discuss the wedding. "The county will attend," she said, "but attendance is not what is required. Witness is." "And witnesses need something to witness," the vicar agreed. Cassandra proposed a public ceremony on the Ashbourne lawn, a gathering of villagers and gentry together. The vicar raised both eyebrows. "Lady Cassandra, you propose to blur lines that enjoy being sharp." "Let them blur," she replied. "I have been sharp my entire life. It has not made me loved." The vicar smiled into his sleeve and booked the day. The storm did not arrive in the sky at first, but in talk. A few gentlemen objected to the impropriety of medical instruments near the sanctity of a marriage. A few ladies objected to the idea of a ceremony that did not require precisely folded invitations. Someone questioned Eliza's credentials, not from ignorance, but from the fear that competence unguilded might unseat competence adorned. Adrian addressed none of it. He played the piano badly and with devotion until the storm decided there was no applause to be earned and departed, bored. The sky, however, had a flair for drama. On the morning of the wedding, clouds arranged themselves into an army. A wind rehearsed. The bunting from the fete came out of the drawer as if eager to serve a more solemn purpose. The villagers arrived in their best, which is to say their cleanest. The gentry arrived in their best, which is to say their least comfortable. Eliza stood with her hands folded around, calm. Cassandra, transformed into grace by the effort of choosing it, adjusted the flowers and instructed the violinist where to stand so that the sound would float in exactly the right direction. The first fat drops of rain fell like commas, asking whether the sentence might pause. Adrian stepped forward, coat unbuttoned, hair already a little rebellious, because he had decided against trying to subdue it for once. "Friends," he said, "not ladies and gentlemen, not tenants and guests, but friends. We shall be married in rain if we must. It makes for good stories later." The county laughed on cue. Courage always sounds like wit when spoken plainly. The rain, perhaps unwilling to be upstaged, relented to a finer mist. Eliza took her place opposite him. The vicar unfolded his book. And because the world respects the brave, the clouds thinned like a crowd making room for late arrivals. Sun fell in a patience of gold across the lawn. "Do you, Adrian Tremaine," the vicar began, "take this woman, Eliza Hartwell?" "I do," Adrian answered prematurely, and then corrected himself with a bow to the vicar and a quick, contrite smile that set the company at ease. Eliza, who believed in tidy stitches and occasional untidiness where it belonged, laughed softly. "I do," she said when it was her turn, and her voice was the kind that makes the word an architecture rather than an ornament. They were declared married, and Adrian kissed her carefully, respectfully, not as a claim, but as a recognition. This is the person with whom the corridor will be walked and the windows opened. Music rose. The violinist, the piano rolled onto the terrace, a flute produced as if from a magician's sleeve. The county applauded, and then, being itself, sought refreshment. Children tumbled in precise chaos. Cassandra stood beside the vicar and looked out over a lawn that had never seen its people gathered together in so unranked a fashion. She exhaled and felt something leave her that she had been trying to keep for no reason that would stand up to inquiry. Chapter 8. The Viscount's Redemption. Even triumph requires organisation. Tables appeared in ranks worthy of admiration from any general. Pies lined up like obedient moons. The violinist, now a friend of the house, played a reel and then a slow air that made old men remember being not old, and young men decide to become particular about how they treated women. The children performed the shepherd play again, because it had been practiced, and because it included a sheep made of a blanket and 3 cousins. Adrian lifted his hand, and the company grew quiet without needing to be asked twice. He climbed 2 steps of the terrace so that he could be seen by those at the rear and heard by those at the front, and for a moment he looked like a man about to command troops. Then he smiled, and the resemblance dissolved. "My friends," he said, "I have been absent from you. I do not say this to summon pity, but to confess a poor use of time. Grief is not a fault, but it is a demanding employer, and I have been its overworked clerk. Today I resign. Not from missing my brother, that will be a lifelong task, but from arranging my house in the shape of sorrow. I have married a woman who organizes life in the shape of mercy. She has taught me that rooms prefer light, and that music is not a luxury, but an instrument of repair." He paused and looked at Eliza. She did not look away, which in itself was a vow. "I intend," Adrian continued, "to dedicate a portion of Ashbourne's income to the Hartwell Fund, for the infirmary, for the school, for the clean water we should have had sooner. And I intend to open the music room every fortnight to any who would play or learn. If you have no violin, bring a voice. If you have no voice, bring ears. If you have none of these, bring appetite. The kitchen will oblige." There was laughter, the pleasant kind that warms without scalding. Cassandra, who had been studying him as if he were a painting she wished to understand, began to clap. The sound caught, multiplied, and became the roar of approval only communities can make, noisy, affectionate, untidy as a quilt. Adrian lifted a hand again, and the applause softened. "Finally," he said, "there is a matter I must settle in public because it has lived too long in private. When my brother died, I believed I had killed him by delay and arrogance. I did not. And even if my error had been larger, it would not have authored the whole story. Illness is a thief that chooses its hour. I have been punishing myself while pretending it was discipline. I am done." He turned to the vicar, who stepped forward, astonished and ready. "Sir, if you will," Adrian said, "say the words that make a dedication. We will name the ward in my brother's memory, not as a reliquary of grief, but as a promise of care." The vicar's voice shook on the first line and steadied by the last. The company bowed heads or did not, according to their habit. The children fidgeted in appropriate quantities. Eliza stood beside Adrian and felt the house change shape inside him and inside the company. Sometimes redemption does not arrive like a single trumpet blast, but as a chord, several notes finding a way to agree. Music rose again, this time from a dozen sources. The violinist began, the piano answered. Someone produced a tin whistle from a pocket as if instructing the day to be brave. Adrian took Eliza's hand and led her into the first steps of a dance that was mostly walking and looking at each other with a frankness that made onlookers kinder. Cassandra turned to Mrs. Penfold. "He has returned," she said simply. "He has," Mrs. Penfold agreed, and then added in the practical manner of a woman who measures triumph by plates washed, "And the kitchen is ready." In the evening, lanterns burned like patient stars. The couples danced until feet declared a truce. The old men told stories that had improved with time. The children fell asleep in improbable places. And the Viscount of Ashbourne, who had been a house where music feared to echo, stood at the terrace rail with his wife and received his people. Not subjects, not tenants. People. A word large enough for everyone gathered. "Thank you," he said to Eliza when they were finally alone, though the lawn still held a patient bustle. "You brought me to my house." "You were always here," she replied. "You only needed the door pointed out." and the windows opened, and the piano lid lifted. He laughed again, the kind that looks forward rather than back. He bent his head and kissed her. No audience now, no ceremony, just the vote two people cast for each other against every discouragement the world can muster. The lanterns winked. The hawthorn released a few petals to the lawn as if to bless the day. Somewhere a whistle played by a man who had forgotten to be shy. And the corridor of doors inside Adrian, once endless and dim, now stood bright, a place one could walk at any hour and not be afraid. The end. If you've enjoyed this story of love, redemption, and quiet courage, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, so you'll be the first to hear our next Regency romance on the Regency Gazette channel. Thank you for listening.